Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Disclosure, Privacy, and Online Brand Conference Call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode, and I would like to now turn the call over to Rachel Becker. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. And thanks to all of you for attending this evening. My name is Rachel Becker. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I'll be your host and co-presenter for today's 60-minute webinar. Next slide, please. So before we begin, a few housekeeping items related to accreditation. And for those of you who don't require this information, please bear with us. It will be as fast as possible. Today's webinar is accredited for CEUs by the National Association of Social Workers, the New York State Education Department's State Board for Social Work, the American Nurses Credentialing Center, the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society for Human Resource Management. If you plan on receiving continuing education credit for this program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must call in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, as well as receive a passing grade on the post-test. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all of this information. That follow-up email will be sent by 5 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, and certificates will be emailed within 4 to 6 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters for this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. So now that that is out of the way, thanks in part to a generous grant from Genentech, Cancer and Careers has created the Balancing Work and Cancer webinar series to provide patients and survivors, as well as healthcare and HR professionals, with concise, targeted information to help you understand a variety of issues that surround balancing work and cancer. Deciding whether to work through treatment or take time off, and whether or not to share your diagnosis at work if you do continue to work, can be complex. Today, we'll help you to think through making these decisions, as well as how to access rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and how to manage privacy at work and online. Next slide, please. And I apologize, one after that as well. Thank you. So as I mentioned, my name is Rachel Becker, and I am Senior Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers. Cancer and Careers is a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their working environment. We do so via our comprehensive website, free publications in English and Spanish, and career coaching. Additionally, we offer educational seminars targeted at employees with cancer and their colleagues and healthcare providers, and certainly employers and caregivers can benefit from the information as well. We are currently also in the process of developing resources that directly address the employment-related challenges being faced by cancer survivors during the novel corona pandemic. To stay informed about these programs as they are rolled out, please sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, and you can do this by visiting our website, cancerandcareers.org, where you can also access all of our other programs and publications, each of which is provided free of charge. Next slide, please. Presenting with me today is Monica Bryant. Monica is a cancer rights attorney and the COO of TRIAGE Cancer, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to providing education on the practical and legal issues that arise after a cancer diagnosis. But most importantly for us, she is a longtime collaborator and is extremely skilled at taking complex legal and insurance issues and making them easier to understand. So thank you, Monica, for being here today.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Next slide, please. So as mentioned, our topic for today is disclosure, privacy, and online brand. And as our key topics, we're going to spend some time talking about whether or not to work. And making the decisions about whether or not to work specifically. We'll introduce the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is an incredibly important piece of their puzzle. And we're going to talk about disclosure and privacy, and then we'll also discuss online brand and social media use. Next slide, please. So to start us off today, we'd like to introduce you to James. James was diagnosed with cancer. He has been a truck driver for a large shipping company for 10 years. James is married with 3 kids and knows that he needs to work to pay his family's bills, and his family has health insurance coverage through his employer. He isn't sure about whether or not he has any employee benefits because he hasn't taken a vacation or sick day in 5 years. He is not sure of his treatment schedule yet, but his doctors told him that he will need surgery and mentioned something about chemotherapy and radiation. What should James be thinking about? Next slide, please. So James is facing what we refer to as the diagnosis work dilemma. And this really sits right at the heart of this work and cancer conversation. And that dilemma is characterized by this central question of, am I going to work or am I not going to work during treatment? And certainly all of you who are on this call are likely in different places in terms of where you are with your cancer experience. I would imagine that we have people who have dialed in who are pre-treatment, some who are actually in treatment and maybe have made some decisions already and so are experts on this topic area in their own right. And then probably some people as well who are after treatment and maybe figuring out what work looks like in this post-treatment phase. And then, of course, we also have healthcare professionals and employers and caregivers. But I think what we can probably all relate to is the idea that at some point in this process, for most people, the questions around how work factors in becomes really, really important. And it can become quite challenging to look at the big picture when you're also focused on addressing a health crisis, because all of the unknowns and all of the questions that come up and can really understandably start to feel overwhelming. And in fact, I would imagine that many of us are currently finding ourselves realizing or remembering on a whole number of levels what it feels like to be in a moment in time that's characterized by a lot of new experiences and unknowns, given everything that's going on in the world right now as well. And I think what's important in these moments is to acknowledge the reality of what's going on, whatever that might be, and from there start to isolate and answer some specific questions that can help illuminate a best path forward. And so when it comes to balancing work and cancer, it's crucial to spend some time considering 2 overarching questions. Next slide. And those are, how important is work to you personally? And then what information do you need to make good decisions about work? And these considerations might happen when you are newly diagnosed and trying to create your initial roadmap through a landscape that includes both treatment and work. But these are also questions you may be asking yourself throughout a treatment experience and even into that post-treatment experience as well, as you continue to figure out what is realistic and comfortable and what your preferences are. Next slide, please. So from there, of course, a whole number of additional questions start to appear as well. The first of which is often, how will treatment affect work and schedule? Are you likely to need some time off for surgery and treatment? What's that going to look like? If you know that you're going to be starting a chemotherapy protocol, is your team able to tell you when you might experience periods of fatigue versus moments when you may feel a little bit more productive and active and able to do your work? Could be helpful as you start to figure out how your tasks are going to continue to get done. Also knowing whether a chemotherapy protocol has an immediate or delayed reaction. So, for example, might you be sitting in a might you be receiving a protocol where you're sitting in the chair and likely to start feeling unwell right away? Or is it the kind of treatment where maybe a few days down the line you will start to have those negative side effects start to kick in? Because in the first situation, maybe you see about having those treatments scheduled for a Friday afternoon so that you can then have the weekend right there to rest and recuperate. Perhaps in the other case of a more delayed response, you might see about having that treatment scheduled for a Wednesday so that there's a bit more time before it all starts to kick in. Also thinking about what goes into actually working for you. So, for example, what happens during our work week isn't entirely limited to the place where we physically do our jobs. Do you have a commute? Obviously, there are a lot of us who are not leaving our homes at this moment in time, but that's going to pass. And so if you think about the reality of what it takes for you to actually get into your work site, is that something that's going to continue to be realistic? Will you have are you somebody who has a 90-minute commute each way in rush hour traffic? Because if so, that 9 to 5 job that you think of yourself as having might actually be a 7:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. job instead. Also, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what else do you want to be able to save some of your personal energy and your personal resources for to make sure it gets done during the week? What are your responsibilities in the home? Do you have children who need help with their homework or an aging parent that you care for? Maybe there's a class that you started taking and drawing and sketching, and it's something that really helps you feel calm and centered and is going to be a wonderful coping mechanism for you. How is that going to continue to factor into your day? And then furthermore, we do want to take a moment to acknowledge the flexibility of the work environment. Do you work in a place where telecommuting is a reality? Are you able to shift around work assignments to others on your team to create a little bit more space in your schedule? We're going to talk more about this in the Working Through Treatments webinar that's being held next month, but it's worth touching on at this moment as well because it's an important part of the question. For many people, financial and insurance needs are also key decision drivers, but that's, of course, not true for everyone. For some people, first and foremost, work is about who they are, particularly in this country where one of the first questions we tend to ask people when we first meet them is, what do you do? And that, when you stop and think about it, is a really profound question because it's kind of posing, or certainly it is for a lot of people, right? There are certainly a percentage of people who, when they hear that, what they're hearing that person ask is, who are you? How are you in the world? And so it's not uncommon when we find ourselves facing a health crisis to think about, what it's going to mean for our job and then what that personally means about our identity and the way that we identify and the way that we think about the way that our days are going to play out. So it's important to talk to your healthcare team about this, not only because it's going to help them to understand where you are coming from, but also so that you can think about how you're going to be able to take care of yourself emotionally during this process. And that's one area where social workers can be particularly helpful. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that gathering some information is critical to help inform some of this decision-making process. And this slide divides into 3 buckets, the types of information that you may want to gather. So the first, of course, is medical and treatment information, which we just spent a little bit of time talking about. Clearly a very critical piece of understanding what your energy levels might be like and your ability to focus and spend time with your job. And then, of course, also workplace information is important to gather. That's the second bucket down. These include things like leave and insurance policies, as well as pre-existing flexibility options. And Monica is going to talk more about this bucket in just a minute. And then there is this third area as well, which is also critical, and that has to do with legal fact-finding in advance. Things like which state and federal protections you might be entitled to at work. And we bring this up in these conversations not because we think it's likely that a situation is going to become litigious. Rather, we bring it up because the practical decisions that have to be made and the legal protections that may be available don't exist in vacuums. And the reality is that in many circumstances, the laws exist as a tool that can really be useful and powerful in creating that roadmap through work and treatment that we've been talking about. But so often, I think we live kind of in fear of the law. We think of it as something that we want to stay on the right side of. We don't want to break. We don't want to get in trouble. And it can also be quite intimidating to think about the law in the context of our jobs. So one of our larger goals for today's webinar is to really demystify some of these laws for you so that you can feel empowered to really understand ways that they can be utilized for your own personal circumstances. Next slide, please.
So if you have ever tried to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle, you know how challenging that can be. Now, imagine trying to do that without ever seeing the picture on the box. It certainly gets a lot harder at that point. And that's really how it can feel to a lot of individuals once they've been diagnosed with cancer, to try to figure out what their options are, what their rights are, and how all of those pieces fit together. So the pieces that I'm talking about are things like the federal laws, the state laws. What is at your specific employer, and what is in your contract potentially that's going to be different from somebody else potentially? What's your workplace like? Does your employer have specific policies you need to understand? And then certainly the finances and insurance coverage plays a role as well. And no two people's puzzle is going to look exactly the same, but most of the time, individuals are going to have to understand each one of these pieces and what their puzzle is going to look like. Next slide, please. So there are a few places where we get rights and benefits in the employment arena. And I do have to make the disclaimer that today we're only going to talk about sort of the tried and true laws. We're not going to be talking about the recent pieces of legislation that Congress has passed within the last month to deal with the novel coronavirus or COVID-19. So some of this is a little bit different depending on where you are right now. But if you're interested in the latest updates and those new pieces of legislation, Triage Cancer is going to be hosting a webinar on April 21st. It's a free webinar. We provide free CEs, and we're going to be doing updates to finances, health insurance, and employment laws based on what's going on right now. So for those of you that are listening thinking, wait a minute, isn't there this thing I've been hearing about? Yes, definitely, but we're still waiting on regulations to come out for those. So today we're just going to talk about sort of the very established laws so far. So there are federal fair employment laws, the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Rehabilitation Act. There are state fair employment laws, and these fair employment laws are going to help protect against discrimination for eligible individuals, as well as provide some individuals with reasonable accommodations, which is a tool to allow somebody to either work through treatment or return to work. And we're going to talk more about that in later segments of this series. There are also leave laws, both federal and state. And finally, an employee working under a contract, like an employment contract or a union contract, should be sure to look to those contracts for the additional or different rights and benefits that they might be entitled to. And I'm going to talk about these laws throughout this series, but if you're looking for information in the meantime, we have several resources available for download on the Triage Cancer website, and I've provided that direct link to the employment page here. Next slide, please. So the the laws are just the bare minimum of what employers have to provide. And the reality is that many employers are much more generous than that bare minimum. So it's critical for an employee to take a look at their employer's specific policies. And these can typically be found in some sort of policy and procedures document or employee handbook. Usually we get these when we're first hired. We don't really look through them. But if you don't think that you have access to that type of document, asking whomever deals with payroll and other employee benefits at your job could be a good starting point. And some of the things that you're going to want to look for are, what are your benefits? Health insurance. Certainly, are there any sort of disability insurance policies or life insurance? What other benefits does your employer provide? So most of us, depending on where we live in the country, if we have access to paid sick time, that's because of an employer policy, not because of a law. Certainly that is true for vacation or paid time, other paid time off. Some employers have policies for flex time or telecommuting. So those are all good benefits to make sure that you understand. And then a good employee handbook or policy and procedures document may also lay out the process for asking for medical leave or asking for a reasonable accommodation. And that's really useful to understand if your employer's already set that out, because it just means that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Next slide, please. Now, there are a few different ways that an employment can be set up. Most of the employees in the United States are considered at-will employees, which means that they can be fired or let go for almost any reason as long as it isn't discriminatory. But certainly there are part-time employees and temporary employees and independent contractors. The laws will all apply differently to people depending on how the employment is set up. Next slide, please. Now, perhaps one of the most important laws for people who are coping with cancer is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And there are multiple parts to the ADA, but for our purposes, we're going to narrow in on Title I, which provides the workplace protections. Now, anyone who's ever heard me speak before has probably heard me talk about the ADA, and it's for good reason. The ADA, again, is such an important tool for individuals coping with cancer and their caregivers, but it's also pretty important in the context of disclosure and online privacy. Many people who are considered or who are diagnosed with cancer don't necessarily consider themselves to have a disability and therefore don't think that they're protected under the ADA. But this is one of those situations where I really urge people not to get caught up in the labels. Otherwise, they might end up missing out on protections. So the ADA is a federal law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, but not everybody is going to be eligible for protection under the ADA. There's a few hurdles that somebody has to jump. First, somebody has to work for a private employer with 15 or more employees or for a state or local government. Now, if they're a federal employee, instead they're going to likely be covered under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is very similar to the ADA in its employment protections. Now, the second hurdle is that you're a qualified individual, which means you can perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. Basically, what that means is that you are qualified for the job in question. If you're applying to be a school teacher, you've had the proper education and you're licensed in that state. And finally, you have to have a disability under the ADA's definition. Next slide, please. Now, under the ADA, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And I realize it's a mouthful, so let me break it down. The first is that you have a physical or mental condition that is limiting a major life activity, and it's doing so substantially. So what's a major life activity? It's going to be anything that the average person in the general population can perform with little or no difficulty. Sleeping, walking, breathing, eating, operation of major bodily functions. These are all considered major life activities. Now, what's interesting to think about when we're talking about cancer is that oftentimes it's not the cancer itself that gives rise to the disability, but rather it's the side effects from treatment that somebody's experiencing, like nausea or chemobrain, lymphedema, fatigue, anxiety. And it could be that one of those side effects is substantial, or it could be that it's a combination of all of those things that creates the presence of a disability under the ADA. Next slide, please. So once we've determined that somebody has cleared those hurdles, so they work for a big enough employer, they're qualified, and they have a disability under the ADA, there are 4 ways to actually use the ADA's protections. So first, if you currently have that physical or mental impairment that's substantially limiting a major life activity, so maybe you're going through treatment and you're suffering from extreme fatigue that makes getting through the workday almost impossible. The second is that you have a history of having that impairment. So maybe you're 10 years out of active treatment, but you are still experiencing late or long-term side effects. The third way is being regarded as having a disability. And this really isn't about your experience or capacity at all, but rather it's about the employer's perception of you. And the employer is perceiving you as having a disability, even though you may not be substantially limited in any way. So, for example, maybe you've lost all your hair, but other than that, going to work is the thing that is getting you through all of this and the normalcy and all of that. But because of the bald head, your employer is now treating you differently. Now, the fourth way that you can be protected is based on your association with a person with a disability. And this is the prong under which caregivers may be able to get some protection. So what does the ADA actually give to somebody in all of these circumstances? So they currently have a disability, they have a history of having a disability, they're being regarded as having a disability, or they're a caregiver. They are protected against discrimination in the workplace. So it means being treated differently because of the cancer diagnosis. Now, if somebody currently has the disability or has a history of having the disability, in addition to being protected against discrimination, they may also be entitled to reasonable accommodations. Now, today we're only talking about the ADA in terms of disclosure, but I have to tell you that reasonable accommodations are one of the most important tools for people who are trying to work through treatment or return to work after treatment. And we're going to talk about it later in the series, but for anyone who wants a head start, I've given you a link to the Triage Cancer Quick Guide here so you can start to get some more information about those now. Next slide, please. Now, we don't really have time to get into details here, but I think it's worth mentioning that similar rights exist in the education arena as well. And if you, excuse me, I'm so sorry, the slide was delayed. In addition to the, there we go. Similar rights exist in the education arena as well. And if you're interested in that, check out cancerfinances.org under the education tab, and you'll be able to get some more information. Next slide, please. There's the slide I was looking for. See what happens when I start talking too quickly. Now, in addition to the federal ADA, there are state fair employment laws as well, and it's important to look at your state's fair employment law because sometimes it's more protective than the federal law. And one of the ways that state laws can be more protective is actually by covering smaller employers. Next slide, please. This chart shows the number of employees that each state requires an employer to have to be covered by the state fair employment law. So, for example, if you live in Illinois, you only need your employer to have one employee to be protected. If you live in California, then your employer has to have 5 employees to be protected. Now, if you don't see your state here, it means that the state law is the same as the federal ADA, so it's going to cover employers with 15 or more employees. And if you'd like more details about your state fair employment law, check out the chart of state laws on Triage Cancer, and you can get some more details there. Next slide, please. Now, one of the most common questions for people in the area of work and cancer is, do I have to tell my employer or my potential employer about my diagnosis? And the answer is, generally, you're not required to share information about your medical condition, except in 3 main circumstances. So first, if you want to use the ADA's protections against discrimination, you may have to share some information. And the rationale for that is if you haven't disclosed anything about your disability, how could your employer be discriminating against you because of your disability? Second, if you're trying to access those reasonable accommodations that I was talking about, you're going to have to share some information about your medical condition. And finally, if you're asking for medical leave, you may also have to disclose some information. But in all of these circumstances, it may not be necessary for you to disclose the specific cancer diagnosis as long as you can provide enough information to justify the need for the particular benefits. Next slide, please. There are pretty specific limits on what employers or prospective employers are able to ask of employees, and it depends on where somebody is in the employment arc. So before an offer of employment is given, for example, in an interview, employers are only allowed to ask can you perform the essential functions of the job? And how would you perform the essential functions of the job? And both of these questions really speak to, are you a qualified individual under the AGA? Now, once an offer of employment has been made, disability-related inquiries or medical exams, regardless of whether or not they're related to the job, can be made, but only if the same question or requirements exist for all employees entering the same job category. In other words, they can't look at somebody and think, that person looks a little bit sick, let's have them take a medical exam. And then finally, once somebody has a job, employers can only make disability-related inquiries or require employees to take medical exams if it is job-related and consistent with business necessity. So, for example, it might be permissible to ask a school bus driver to take an eye exam every year to make sure they can safely drive children, or to have law enforcement take a medical exam to make sure that they can safely perform their duties. That is job-related and consistent with business necessity. Next slide, please. Now, if somebody is asking for a reasonable accommodation or medical leave, they're probably going to be required to fill out some sort of medical certification form. This is called something different everywhere, but basically what it is it's a form that an individual takes to their healthcare provider and asks them to certify that they are in fact eligible for the reasonable accommodation or the medical leave based on what's going on with their health. It is very important for healthcare providers and patients to be talking about what that person is disclosing at their workplace before the forms are filled out. Because if somebody isn't planning on disclosing a specific diagnosis to their employer, they need to tell the healthcare provider that so that the healthcare provider can still include enough information about the medical condition, the side effects, or whatever is going on to qualify them to use the protections, but without oversharing. Because, as I mentioned, a diagnosis may not be required. But where this becomes a practical issue is that many employers create their own forms and may, in fact, ask for more information than they're legally entitled to. So we talk a lot about talking with your healthcare team about concerns if you are concerned about disclosing your diagnosis in the workplace, to see if together you can come up with a way to complete the form that is honest but also keeps your information private. Now, if someone does not want to disclose, but they're given an employer form with a line for diagnosis, an option could be turning in the U.S. Department of Labor's model form for the FMLA instead, because the model form does not have a line for diagnosis. And these model forms can be found on the Department of Labor website for download or on that employment page that I showed you earlier on Triage Cancer. But one challenge with these forms, even the Department of Labor's form, is that the employer is able to ask for the specialty or type of practice of the healthcare provider who is providing the certification. So if you ask your oncologist to complete the form, it's likely going to inform the employer of the diagnosis. But again, if you don't want the employer to know your exact diagnosis, there are some options here. Next slide, please. The FMLA lays out all of the different healthcare providers that are allowed to fill out the medical certification form. So what we generally suggest is think about what is the specific need for leave and which healthcare provider can best speak to that need. So, for example, if someone is experiencing neuropathy in their feet, maybe a podiatrist would be a perfectly appropriate person to go to. But certainly talking with a primary care physician or expressing your concerns to your oncologist, we've heard many oncologists say, well, if a patient expressed concern to me about disclosure, I would happily write internal medicine or internist on the form. It is completely honest, but again, doesn't divulge more information than the individual wanted to disclose. So Rachel and I are not suggesting that people shouldn't be disclosing this information at their workplace. We really just want to stress that for individuals who have feelings about keeping their medical information separate from their employment, that they have the right to do so and to feel empowered to still access the rights and benefits that they're entitled to while maintaining that privacy. Now, there are certainly some rules around what employers are allowed to do and not do. So certainly they can't ask for copies of medical records or put medical information in your regular file or contact your healthcare provider, except in a couple of instances. If somebody's asking for medical leave, then the employer can contact the healthcare professional who filled out the form to authenticate or clarify. Authenticate means I'm just checking that you, healthcare professional, did in fact sign the form and it wasn't forged. Clarify means, could you tell me what your handwriting says on line 3? I can't read it. Not, could you clarify what you mean by fatigue? So it's very, very specific for the FMLA. Now, under the ADA with reasonable accommodations, it's a little less specific, but it can't happen without the employee's permission. So again, that's another opportunity for the employee and the healthcare team to have a conversation about what they are or are not disclosing to their employer. Next slide, please.
So now we would like to introduce you to Daniela. Daniela is 38 and was diagnosed with cancer earlier this week. She's worked at a large department store for 3 years. She's using sick time to take time off work for her surgery next week and to recover. She's waiting to hear if she will also need chemotherapy. She is concerned about sharing her diagnosis at work. Her supervisor is not very supportive, and a coworker was let go shortly after her husband had a heart attack. She is worried that she might be treated differently or even fired if they find out she has cancer. While Daniela is a private person, her mother is addicted to Facebook. Daniela shared her diagnosis with her mother, and soon after, her mother posted on Facebook that Daniela had been diagnosed with cancer. Within a few hours, Daniela started receiving phone calls and had to explain her diagnosis to each caller, which left Daniela feeling exhausted. What should Daniela be thinking about? Next slide, please. So as we move into this conversation about social media and online brands and disclosure in this particular space, we wanted to give you some data points to kind of set the stage here. So this comes from some research done by PricewaterhouseCoopers. It was done in 2012, so a little bit old at this point, but what it really illustrates is that across all ages, we see people using social media to learn more about their health and to discuss what's going on with their health. They found that more than 75% of Americans use social media to research their symptoms. 90% of people between the ages of 18 and 24 stated that they trust medical information shared on their social feeds. But then also 45% of 45 to 64-year-olds would be likely to share by social media, while 56% would be likely to engage in health activities. So this is a behavior that we are really seeing happening across the population. Next slide, please. These next data points come from a survey that Cancer and Careers did just last year with Harris Interactive, where we talked to cancer patients and survivors about their online media use. And in it, we found that 26% of the people that we surveyed had disclosed their cancer diagnosis on social media. 11% said disclosing their diagnosis on social media had a negative impact on their career. 17% regret posting information about cancer diagnosis on social media, and 28% expressed concern about their employer discovering cancer diagnosis through social media. So we know that this is that disclosure on social media is something that is happening, and we know that there are some potential negative repercussions to doing this. And just as Monica was saying with medical certification, she and I are not suggesting in any way that you should never share information about what's going on with cancer or your health on social media. Again, we're really trying to empower you with information so that you can feel in control of the way that your story is being shared in what essentially is a very public space. Next slide, please. And that is because one thing that has been going on for quite a few years now is that employers, just like everyone else on the planet, Google. And we know that usually this Googling is not done in any sort of malicious way. Typically, if somebody who is looking to hire, is Googling someone, it's usually because they've made a good impression on paper. And so that hiring manager or that potential manager is looking for more information to support bringing that person in for a job interview or bringing them in for a second or third conversation. Similarly, when we hear about existing managers Googling people on the team that they're supervising so that they might have conversations with them more as humans, so that they're not entirely work focused. But just because these are the motivations that are driving the Google search, it doesn't mean that they won't accidentally stumble across information that you might have preferred stay out of the workplace. And so again, we hear, Monica and I travel all around the country, and we hear a lot of stories about people who are really benefiting from the support that they get on social media during their cancer journey and the way that they're able to connect. And that's all wonderful. It's certainly one of the great benefits that's coming from this software is our ability to feel less alone during these moments of isolation, right? Again, taking on a whole new flavor during this moment in time. But even in normal circumstances, the cancer experience can feel very isolating. So we don't want to take that away. But we do want you to feel in control because we know employers are Googling. And, of course, there are privacy settings on mainstream social media platforms. Next slide, please. And but the reality of those privacy settings is that they're not perfect. And so the image that you see on this slide was pulled from the Wall Street Journal in March of 2013. And so what it really illustrates is all of the steps that would have had to be taken in March of 2013 in order to make sure a person's Facebook profile was entirely protected. And that, of course, there's a lot of tiny print. That's a lot of steps that would have had to be taken. But what's even more to the point is the fact that by April of 2013, this is likely outdated because Facebook and sites like it are designed really as commercial products. They're designed to sell us things, and so they make their money from advertisers. And what those advertisers are looking for in exchange for their dollars is data about the people who are using Facebook. And so essentially, the privacy settings, the rules can change overnight, and we're not always notified when that happens. So even if you were to have taken all the time to complete these steps in 2013, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're still that they would still be in place, that they would still be relevant, even the very next day when you woke up. There's no way of knowing. Next slide, please. Now, there are alternatives to mainstream social platforms that can allow you to stay in touch and keep a chosen group of people updated about a treatment status or a disease trajectory. These two that we have listed on this slide, My Lifeline and Caring Bridge, may be familiar to a lot of you on this call, if not all of you. What I think is worth mentioning about both of these is that My Lifeline and Caring Bridge do not default into the highest level of protection. There are 3 levels of privacy settings. They do not change frequently. I can say that with confidence because we monitor those very closely at Cancer and Careers. We actually check quarterly to make sure that those privacy settings the privacy policies haven't changed. But you want to make sure that you're opting into the level that's right for you. Also important to know that there's an option on both My Lifeline and Caring Bridge to connect your posts to your Facebook account. So take a look at that, see what it's set to, and make sure that it's set to what your preference is. because if you are trying to keep the information about your illness off of Facebook, you want to make sure that your My Lifeline or Caring Bridge are not connected to it as well. And of course, it's also a good idea to, in general, review any privacy policies for websites or listservs or forums, anywhere that you might be sharing personal information about what's going on with you, to make sure that you fully understand where that information is going to go. Next slide, please. And of course, what we recommend is thinking through what a personal disclosure plan looks like for you and make very active decisions about where you do want to share that information. So as I just mentioned, some people might make the decision that they're going to share with their Caring Bridge community, but they're not going to share with their Facebook community, or that maybe they do feel comfortable sharing on Facebook and they're going to keep it private, but they don't want to make that conversation happen on LinkedIn because LinkedIn is what they consider to be their professional platform, and they want to leave that out of the conversation. But regardless of what decisions you make, it's a good idea to not just know what they are for yourself, but also communicate them to people in your circles. We have heard a number of stories from people over the years who tell us about a well-intended sister who was trying to be a cheerleader and accidentally disclosed what was going on Facebook because she didn't realize that the patient, her sister, was not wanting all of that information to be public. So really communicating that out is smart and proactive, and certainly in Daniela's case, that could have been a good thing for her to have done. And it's also, and one of the things that you want to consider when you're formulating this disclosure plan is the potential long-term impact of sharing in these forums. So perhaps you're in a situation where your boss at work is amazing and you've already disclosed and your team is being super supportive, and so you feel right now that you're not particularly concerned about sharing online because everybody knows what's going on. Well, the reality is that none of us can really see what's going to happen down the line. And so you may be at a job that feels really great and stable right now, and then 5 years from now find that you're looking for work again. And there's that information that you shared, and maybe you wish that that didn't come up when an employer is Google searching you. So these are important things to think about. And then, of course, we also hear from people who are looking for relationships, who are dating, that their potential dates are Googling them as well, and sometimes finding out information about their health well before they've even had a chance to sit down with them and have that face-to-face connection and conversation to give them a sense of who they are. So something else to consider when you're thinking about online disclosure. Next slide, please.
And then there are a few other ways that other information may be out there about you, both in the digital space and out, that's worth realizing and understand how and thinking through how you might respond if it comes up. So certainly if you volunteer or work in the cancer community, what does that potentially say about you? And how might you respond in a way where you can still maintain your privacy if that's what you're choosing to do? Certainly, if you've participated or had an online fundraiser set up, like a GoFundMe, those sites are really designed to make all the information about you public and Googleable. So crowdfunding is a great resource, but there's also some downsides to it as well. Now, many employers may be conducting background or credit checks before they hire somebody. And if you've had a challenging financial situation due to your cancer diagnosis and that's impacted your credit, what does that say about you? And how might you be able to respond to those inquiries, again, in a way that you can still maintain your privacy? Now, many employers own their employees' voicemail and email and even search engine history. So if you're trying to keep information about your diagnosis completely private from work, you may not want to have your doctor's offices leaving messages on your work phone or using your work email to communicate with them. This is not to say that employers are spending all of their time listening to employees' voicemails or reading emails. We're just pointing out some of the potential areas for inadvertent disclosure for you to think about. And then Unfortunately, we're in a situation where we have to actually pay attention to things like social media password laws, because there are some employers who are actually demanding that people hand over the passwords to their private social media accounts. So even if you've done all the things you're supposed to do to keep your profiles and your accounts private, if they're given access to the back end, they can see all of that. Now, that behavior has brought on a spate of local and state level lawsuits around the country, whether or not that's even legal. But again, the law is sort of slower than technology to keep up, and there's no way that we can know everything. So again, we're just really trying to think about, have everyone be thinking about disclosure and the importance that the online piece brings. Next slide, please.
So this is a question that we get frequently, which is, should I disclose my cancer history on a resume, on a cover letter, during an interview? And it's a great question to ask. And ultimately, what we like to advise is that it's really up to you. If you want to share, for some people it feels very, very important that they want to make sure that anyone that they would be working for is aware of their cancer history. But what I will offer as well is that, if you do want to share that information, what we recommend doing is waiting until you've had at least one person interview for the job, and here's why. People who do hiring typically find themselves looking at pretty big piles of resumes and cover letters, and part of the process involves just making decisions about who's going to get to the next step and who's not going to get to the next step. And there have been some research studies that have been done over the last few years that have actually shown that people who disclose either that they have been diagnosed with cancer or that they have some sort of disability are less likely to get called in for jobs if they share that information in the cover letter. So the idea being that when somebody's just a name on a piece of paper amongst a whole other pieces of paper, people, whether consciously or unconsciously, make these sort of discretionary choices about what pile that resume or cover letter is going to go into. Whereas when you go in and have an interview, you move from being that just collection of information on a piece of paper to being this full, rich, dynamic, capable person. And that interaction can add a whole lot more color to the experience, and it can help you read and sense and get an idea of whether it's a good fit and if it seems right to share that information. It's not necessarily relevant to whether or not you can do the job. So not the thing that you should be focused on in any of these communications. What you should be focused on in all of these communications are selling yourself as the best possible candidate for the job. And we do have a number of other webinars and resources on job searching and how to position yourself to do that well. So if you're interested in those, please check out our website, send us an email, and we can help point you in the right direction to get that started. Next slide, please. We do hear also from people with concerns that they're going to be asked about a gap in a resume during an interview. And so what we recommend in those situations is that people use a verbal technique that we call the swivel, which involves acknowledging the question that was asked and inserting the word "and" in there, and then moving the conversation back to a place that has to do with that point that I was just discussing on the last slide, which is really selling themselves as the person who's most capable for the job. So that might sound like someone saying, well, I was dealing with a family issue that is now resolved, and I'm thrilled to discuss how my management skills can help build the team and grow your business. And so what they've done is what this person has done is that they've broadly acknowledged that, yes, there's a gap on my resume. They haven't brought cancer into it. Cancer is very much a family issue, so it is a version of the truth that they are sharing. And then they are moving the conversation over to a place that's relevant to the interview, relevant to whether or not they're the best candidate for the job. And people tend to pick up those conversations from where we leave them off. Next slide, please. And there are, of course, ways to use your professional online identity and shape it consciously and leverage it in order to to sell yourself as a professional online, or to move some of the posts that you may have made that no longer represent who you are. You might consider deleting those posts for sure, but certainly then taking the time to craft additional posts that really illustrate what it is that you bring to the table, that what you're thinking about professionally. Setting up a professional web page or blog, that's something that's usually going to come up rather high in any Google search that's done. And on our website, we do have a couple of webinars that are archived that you might want to check out if you'd like to learn more about building a professional online brand. The first is called Building a Professional LinkedIn Profile, and it's linked at the bottom of the slide there. And then we also have an archived webinar on using social media to tell your best story. So you might want to check that one out as well. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation for today. Next slide, please. We're after 7 right now, but let's see if we can have time to take 1 or 2 more questions. Before we move to the Q&A, we do have some additional resources available for you as well, where you can get more information on employment rights and legal assistance. Next slide, please. I also wanted to mention a number of webinars that we have coming up. So these are the webinars that we have had set and scheduled since January of 2020, but as I mentioned earlier, we are also in the process of developing some programs that address employment-related needs during the COVID-19 crisis, and please stay tuned because we're going to be rolling those out fairly soon, and a few of them will be taking place this month as well. Next slide, please. Additionally, we have some online support services and information resources to help you with your various employment-related needs. We have those linked here. And then next slide, please. That is my and Monica's contact information. So, like I said, I see we have a question in the Q&A box already. And we'll see if any of you want to ask your questions on the phone as well. But if we don't get to your question today, please do feel free to reach out to us. We like to think of this as the beginning of a conversation. So we will do our best to get a response back to you as soon as possible. Next slide, please. And I'm going to put those CEU requirements up on the screen one more time for those of you who might need them. And then, Jim, if you could explain for our audience how the Q&A is going to work.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Rachel. To our audience joining tonight, if you prefer to ask a live question, simply press star and 1 on your telephone keypad. Pressing star and 1 will place your line into a queue. And a friendly reminder that if you're joining this evening while on a speakerphone, please return to your handset prior to pressing star and 1 to be certain that your signal does reach our equipment. Again, that is star and 1 if you'd prefer to ask your question live over your telephone line. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Jim, and a very good reminder about speakerphones. Okay, so the first question that we have in the Q&A box comes to us from Hannah. Hannah says, I have not disclosed on my personal social media accounts, but I do participate in cancer groups on Facebook. Are those searchable? So that is a great question, and the answer to that, unfortunately, or fortunately, the true answer is that it depends. There is an option in Facebook groups to set them to be entirely unsearchable so that they can only be visible to the people who are in those groups. In fact, we at Cancer and Careers have one set up for people who have received our travel scholarships in the past for them to communicate. And we are very, very stringent about researching privacy policies and making sure that, that things are as protected as possible and that we're not putting anyone in a circumstance where they may be compromised. And so there was a level on Facebook that met our smell test. But I don't know what the settings are in the group that you're in. So this is a great example of where you might want to take a look and see if you can find information just in the general settings. Usually when groups are set up, there's somebody who's a moderator, and so you might reach out to the moderator and see if they're able to provide you with any information about what the particular privacy settings are for that group. And again, if this is something that you want to talk about further, if you reach out to the moderator and they're not sure and they want to talk to us, shoot me an email. Sissy, could you put our contact information back up on the screen again? Shoot me an email, and we can have this conversation further. That one. Perfect. Thank you. Jim, do we have anyone on the phone?
Rachel. We do have a question on the phone, if you're ready to take it.
Sure.
Certainly.
Thank
Denise, please go ahead. Your line is open.
Yes. So my question is, there is typically an online application that you do when you're applying for a job. And in larger companies, there's that government section that says, do you have a disability? And it basically outlines that. And it has yes, no, or I do not wish to answer. How do you disclose? Do you disclose that or not? And is there a benefit in there? I've been told, yes, there's a benefit. In my case, I've not disclosed those type of answers.
So that is a great question, and it is one that we get quite often. Monica, do you want to jump in and take that one?
Sure. So those questions, those types of demographic questions are permissible as long as they have that option of, do not wish to answer or prefer not to answer, sort of an opting out to that. Now, a lot of times those questions are being asked because a particular company may be giving deference or sort of added points to somebody who might have a disability. So it's not always a malicious question, although it can sometimes feel like it's prying. What we generally recommend is that if somebody is planning on keeping the information about their medical condition private, which I hope we've made the point is absolutely our right to do so, that you put prefer not to answer on all of those demographic questions, so gender, race, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you answer all those other ones, but then say, I don't want to answer the one about disability, that could be some sort of red flag to somebody. And the problem is with those applications, you never know. You never get to sit in front of someone and explain it. So the general rule of thumb is sort of, if you're not going to disclose that, don't disclose anything. Now, in terms of there being, a benefit, not being a benefit, it's really going to be company specific. You could certainly do some research into the company to see, what types of hiring practices they have. Like if they do fundraisers for cancer organizations, then maybe you might want to disclose. And it's, that's a really personal decision.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. So I'm looking at the time. We're getting close to 10 after 7. So I think that we're gonna stop it here. My apologies to everyone who did not get their question answered. Please do send us an email, and we will do our best to get an answer back to you as quickly as possible. Monica, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to all of you who dialed in. Happy holidays to those who are celebrating. And we look forward to seeing you at the end of the month, perhaps, for some of our new webinars, and next month when we talk about working through treatment as part of this series. Thanks so much.